Thank you everyone for joining us for another episode of L&D Disrupt Live. Joining Nelson and myself this week, we've got Kasper Spiro, who, alongside being the host of the Untold Stories in L&D podcast, is also the co-founder of Easygenerator. And if you don't know who Easygenerator are, their e-learning software simplifies and speeds up course creation for people. So Kasper is perfectly placed to talk to us today about the golden rules for creating great learning content. Creating good content in general is a universal problem. I think it's not just limited to L&D, or I think from sales to almost everything. Design is a problem. But Kasper, why exactly is this such a tricky one for L&D to get right? And so what was the moment for you that made you realize this was a big problem for L&D?
Yeah, so I was responsible for the creation of e-learning for a long time, working in the industry for more than 25 years now. And I love e-learning, but I always felt a couple of things are against it. And that is the process of creating e-learning is slow and expensive, because you have somebody in L&D, an instruction designer, is going to interview people in the business and to get the knowledge from the business, and going back and forth and putting that in an e-learning course takes a lot of time. So that's also why it's expensive. But I remember that my sort of epiphany came when I was in my previous job, so that's more than 10 years ago. I was implementing Moodle for Shell, the oil company, the learning management system. And at the end of the whole thing, we had to migrate courses from the old system to the new one. And I just asked, okay, are those courses up to date or not? And they said, yeah, we're focusing on that, so we're fine. But I want to check. So we just randomly got 100 courses out and found an SME with each of them. And just one question, is the course still valid? Is it still actual? And the shocking outcome was that none of them was. All of those courses were outdated. And some of them were like 3 weeks old. Some of them were 3 years old. But the thing is that because it's the L&D function that is responsible for the maintenance, they are not in the business. They don't know when things are changing. And that was sort of the moment that I thought, okay, wait a minute, we're doing something wrong. It should be the business who is responsible for the creation and the maintenance. So that is what Easygenerator does. It's a very simple authoring tool, but it's not for instructional designers. It's for basically for subject matter experts, people in the business, so they can create content, but also maintain the content and make sure it's actual and up to date.
Nelson, did you have a similar sort of light bulb moment or an epiphany like Kasper put it?
Yeah, I think my light bulb moment really came from being a learner, or I should say a victim of really bad learning content in my kind of early career. And it was just trying to figure out, how is it that there's so much great content that we consume on so many different platforms, but the content I get given at work to learn the thing that I need for my job is so terrible. And especially when it's not mandatory content, now you're really fighting for an employee's attention. And so that's when you could kind of get away with terrible content when you slap on a mandatory label because I have to do it. But once you remove that label, that's when you really find out how bad this content is. And you sometimes see this in companies where there is a course or a resource that's available that answers the question that you have. But instead of looking at that resource, you'd just much rather tap on the shoulder of your colleague and just go, can you just tell me the answer to this thing? Because that's really what I need. And I don't want to really have to go through that terrible content. So I think having been a victim and then, getting to work over the last few years with hundreds and thousands of different L&D managers and L&D professionals, and seeing the other side of the table and realizing, these are the challenges that they're facing. And this is why the learning content I was experiencing was so terrible or irrelevant. I think that was the light bulb moment of really understanding, neither party was winning here, right? Neither L&D or the learner were winning here. So that's always a good indication that something needs to change.
Totally agree. I think it's like a failing marriage in a lot of companies. That's the analogy. No one's happy. Both want a divorce, but no one wants to say anything. Two of the things you touched on there lead us nicely to the first rule, and that is using internal experts to make sure content stays up to date. So like you said, Nelson, I mean, whether people are intentionally doing it or not, this kind of bottom-up learning is happening anyway. So, and as Kasper pointed out, the people obviously creating content a lot of the time aren't in the business itself. So I guess it's more of a question of how can people leverage their internal experts in the right way to make sure, like you said, content tackles a specific problem, but it also remains up to date for the challenge at hand. Kasper, do you want to kick us off and then we'll bring in Nelson after?
Yeah, so indeed, because if you say that content should be created and maintained by people in the business, it's not that there's no role for L&D. So we see two sort of versions of that. We see what we call the regulated approach and the democratized approach. So you could see the tool like Easygenerator, for example, as a knowledge sharing tool. You give it to everybody and everybody's free to create something and publish something. But what we see happening more is where L&D is still playing a role. So they can initiate sometimes a certain topic, but instead of interviewing somebody, you ask the person or the group of persons to create the course themselves. You can help them design, you can assist them, you can edit them, you can co-author, you can do all those kind of things, as long as you don't take over the responsibility for the creation and the maintenance. So that should be in the business, but all those other things you can do. So your role changes a bit from creator to co-creator, from controller to facilitator. But there is still a big role for L&D. And it's also a great way, for example, we see examples with some of our customers, like, for example, with Nielsen. They have people in 140 countries. They don't have the capacity to create all that content for all those people from one central point. And now they just have one or two people who are managing that from L&D, and they create like thousands of courses through that approach. So it's also a big capacity boost there.
Yeah, I think to kind of add to that, the most common pushback we see from companies and L&D professionals when we're talking about knowledge sharing and getting internal experts to create content is often this element of trust and having an approval process. You know, the number of times we've heard from L&D professionals, oh, can we have a way of approving everything before it gets published and shared? Which is actually counterproductive, because the whole point of this is because you don't want L&D to become a bottleneck, right? And at the rate at which knowledge is being created, it is impossible for L&D to be able to review and approve every bit of user-generated content or expert-generated content that's coming in. And so it does require a mindset shift where you're now approaching it more as a community that needs to be moderated rather than content that needs to be reviewed and approved. And what you tend to find is the community does moderate itself, right? You know, if you've got the right tools in place, people will flag something when it's inappropriate. If you give them the tools to say, this is irrelevant or this is now inaccurate, then they will let you know. And that becomes an easier way to manage that. And then building on what Kasper said, is really L&D's role becomes setting the guidelines for, you know, what type of content should you be creating? How can you go about creating this content in the most, so it has the biggest impact and it's meaningful to the learner? And you can guide that process and really, you know, educate and empower the internal experts to do it in the most effective way. And I think that's really where L&D can play a critical role, rather than having to be the ones that are creating every type of content. And empowering internal experts is critical for any business to be able to learn at the speed to match the rate of change that we're seeing around us. Because the risk you have as a company, if your internal experts are not a part of creating content and they're not capturing what they know, when they leave, all of that good stuff will leave with them. And what you essentially have is a leaky bucket, right? And in this day and age, no company can afford to learn the things they once knew already. We have just enough time to learn the things that we need to learn for the first time. And so you really need a way where you're creating a company brain where your internal experts are being empowered to capture what they know. And it's a fundamental part of building a learning culture that's fit for modern times. And so I think gone are the days where it's a choice, right? If you're not doing it, you are going to fall behind.
So I couldn't agree more, by the way, Nelson, but just to add to that, so what we see a lot is that you start talking about governance and having your check and balances. So what is really crucial, indeed, we call it like the Wikipedia effect. So people are correcting incorrect content anyway, but we always, in Easygenerator, have a review option. So we always encourage people, before you publish it, have one or two people at least look at it, give you feedback so we improve it. But the thing is, if you talk to L&D people about governance, so what I do then, I ask them, what is your procedure? And then they have a procedure where they do a couple of checks and balances. So before publishing the course, it is checked. But the thing is, they don't have the knowledge to check if it's correct. So they can only look at it from a didactical perspective. And the thing is that it only has like a tiny impact, because the life cycle of a course starts after publishing, and nobody ever has a maintenance plan there. So how do you keep it up to date? Because that is what the subject matter experts should do. So even if you build under governance, it's just a small impact. It's just the moment of publication, which is the start of the life of a course, but not the life cycle. And that is where the big difference is being made.
Perfect. I've got a couple of quick fire questions off the back of that, but Kasper, maybe you can elaborate on this regulated versus democratic approach a little bit more before we move on.
Yeah, so it really depends. So what we see, the approaches are a bit different, where people see it as knowledge sharing. So it's more like what Nelson said. So you have to have trust in your employees that they will do the right thing. You have to have trust in your company that they will correct it if it's incorrect. And there are a couple of things you can do to sort of make that easier, but not everybody is ready for that. But it's also, we see it, some companies are going for one approach, so really regulated and have it L&D initiated. Other ones go more for the democratized approach and really enabling, empowering their employees. But most of the time you see a mix, because in certain roles, it's more logical to do it like the one way or the other way. Or in certain countries, because of the culture who is different, things are a bit more top down or bottom up. So what you see happening, it's not a black and white thing. It's sort of a mix, and you have some companies that are more on one side of the spectrum and some who are more on the other side of the spectrum, but it's not, it's sort of a mix of both.
Perfect. Thanks, Kasper. And Nelson, a sort of follow-up question you might be able to shed some light on is, what are the typical challenges people might expect when they take this approach? I guess one would be the opposite of a bottleneck, is just like a big tidal wave of content if people aren't regulating it. But what are some of the challenges people might encounter?
Yeah, I think getting a lot of content, not necessarily, I mean, to give you an example, one of our customers, Gymshark, did this really, really well, where they did it with their support team. And from the moment they launched, they essentially empowered all of their support reps to capture what they know and convert that into nuggets of knowledge. And because they did that really early on, they built this culture of, if someone's going to ask the same question twice, then it needs to be captured as a nugget. And what they were able to do is essentially build this company brain, and they were able to build a search first culture, because as a result, everyone knew, well, before I interrupt someone and tap on someone's shoulder, let me search first, because there's a good chance someone's captured this knowledge. And when you empower internal experts, you get that. Now, the flip side, the challenge is, if this isn't moderated or reviewed, then you end up with a landfill site, like Kasper mentioned, of out of date and irrelevant content. And that is, I would say, the biggest risk that you have when you open up for knowledge sharing and internal experts creating content, is beyond a certain point, now you've got a ton of stuff that might become irrelevant. So one of the ways, and this by no means is the only way, one of the ways we tackle this is within How Now, we have something called the verifier, where you can essentially assign a verifier who's an internal expert, who's in a position where they can essentially, at regular verification intervals, they can go in and verify, is this content still up to date and relevant? Now, if it isn't verified, there's a little note that the learner will see that manages their expectation to say, just bear in mind, this content hasn't been verified for X period of time. Now, on the flip side, the L&D professionals and the content creators have a dashboard where they can track what percentage of the content has been verified. Now, historically, when we look at this data, the higher the percentage of verified content, the higher the engagement people get. And that isn't rocket science. It's just people have more trust in the content that you offer, right? If they know it's verified, they know it's reliable. If it's reliable, then they're more likely to use it. And so that's one way of tackling this challenge of ending up with a landfill site of content that becomes redundant.
I think we'll obviously discuss like marketing techniques that can be used, but that reminds me of, there's a recency bias in search results. So if something is created in 2022 versus 2018, there is a recency bias that will increase the likelihood of someone clicking. So yeah, we'll come to this in a bit, but I think keeping content up to date is a great way to ensure that people find it and connect with it more. Like a price in this would be a good example. If it's created in 2018, there's going to be skepticism that's still relevant. So by having that verification process in place, you also make people more confident in the content, I guess, as well. But Kasper, I cut you off there. Were you going to come in and add something?
Yeah, well, yeah, I was thinking about that sort of, it touches on the purpose, what we want to achieve. And so I like to refer to a quote it's a quote from Louis Platt. He used to be the CEO of HP. And he said, if HP knew what HP knows, we would be 3 times more productive. And I love that quote. So, because if you think about it, so if somebody in your company has a question, probably somebody else has the answer. If somebody in your company has a problem, probably somebody else has a solution for that problem. And that is what you want to achieve. You want to sort of capture the knowledge, Nelson, what you were saying, like the company brain. You want to capture the knowledge, get it from the brain of your employees into your company brain and make it available. And if you are able to do that, it would be, I don't know if it's 3 times more productive, but it would be a big boost for productivity, because people can solve problems quicker. They can prevent problems from happening. So they would be way more productive. So that is really the goal you want to achieve with leveraging the power and the knowledge of the employees.
I think something in there leads us nicely to the next rule. So you mentioned that if someone in the business knows how to do it, it's because it's contextual at the end of the day. And that is probably one of the things that gets often missed out of the equation, is what's the context for where the content's going to be applied. There's a great analogy in your book, Nelson, though. I like the one about the fish and the water. People think about the fish, but not the water. But maybe more pertinent to this is this idea of moments that matter, which we spoke a little bit about before, but I don't think we dug into what are the factors that influence moments that matter. So maybe you can tell us about them and sort of what the factors are.
Yeah, I mean, context is surprisingly overlooked so often when designing learning experiences and creating learning content. And much like fish out of water, learning content that's designed without the context doesn't last that long. And the mistake that often L&D professionals make is when content isn't working, they invest more in content and they try to make it, quote unquote, more fun and interactive. They think that's what's missing. We jump to the conclusion that it's not fun and interactive enough, hence people are not engaging with this or finding value in this content. But they don't look at the fact that it wasn't delivered or fit for the moments that matter. And so what moments that matter are? They are the moments where if you connect that individual with relevant learning, it has the capacity to shape their performance if you connect it with them in the moments that matter. And you have micro moments that matter and macro moments. So a macro moment that matters would be when I've just been promoted as a first-time manager. That's a moment that matters, where by connecting me with relevant learning, you can shape how I perform in that macro moment that matters. And then a micro moment that matters might be I'm on a call with a potential customer and they've just asked me a question. And knowing the answer to that question in that moment that matters can shape my performance. And so it's designing learning content for both those macro and micro moments. And I'll just quickly touch on a few things to take into account to design for those moments that matter when you're creating content. So one of those would be environment. It sounds obvious, but often we create a very one-size-fits-all content, but not everyone in your workforce might be working in the same environment. So say, for example, if I'm working in a dark environment, it really makes no sense if the material is all about reading, right? Or for example, I'm working in a noisy environment. If you're designing content that needs to be listened to, then you're not really taking into account. So there are different things like that. And you can also use the environment as a trigger, right? For example, we're all now post-COVID probably familiar with QR codes more than we ever were before. But the idea of using QR codes in a physical environment to trigger and prompt and connect you with relevant learning content is one example. Another one might be technology. What tools do I have access to? And design your learning content for that tool. So if I only have my mobile phone available, then optimize the learning content you're creating for your mobile phone versus a desk-based worker who's sat at a computer or a laptop who can experience a different type of content. Then you've got time. How much time does someone have? If someone's very busy and they're on a shop floor, then maybe you need to think about your content being minutes long rather than hours long, and really taking into that into account. Activity is the other factor you can think about. What are they doing in that moment that matters? Are they interacting with someone else? Are they using a machine? All of these things give you an idea of how much of their bandwidth is already being consumed. And therefore you can start to design for that. The other one is then organization. So what does the culture of that organization, do you have the psychological safety for someone to feel confident enough to ask questions and to get those answers? Do you have the psychological safety for me to learn what I need to and put that into practice without the fear of repercussions for getting it wrong? And the last one is external factors. So what's happening in your industry and market in that moment that matters, that will then inform the content that you create. So thinking about these influences helps you create content that can shape performance in those moments that matter.
I think a good example that brings all of those or most of those things together is, I don't know if anyone's a frequent gym goer, but a lot of new gym machines have a QR code on them and you can scan it and it will give you an instructional video. So it kind of ticks a lot of those boxes there. It's low friction, it accommodates the device people are using. Maybe they have that psychological safety because they're not using a machine they don't know how to use. Someone will sort of guide them through it. So I think that's probably like a good real life example that came to me when you mentioned that, Nelson.
Yeah.
Casper, what are your thoughts on context?
Yeah, so that touches on the fact that you need different kind of content in different kind of context. A theory that's really close to what Nelson was saying that I really endorse is the theory from Conrad Gottfredson and Bob Mosher, and it's called the 5 moments of learning need. And what they found is that, by the way, really funny story, because Conrad actually told me that in his first job, he sort of came up with landed a learning job, and he need to find out. He said it can't all be the same. So he sort of started to figure out what are the different types of learning that we have. And what he found is that there are learning needs when something is completely new or where there's a lot of extra information, then you have a big learning need. And then like a training mindset and a training approach is probably a valid one. So it could be either a face-to-face session, it could be a classroom training, a face-to-face training, whatever you want, an e-learning course, all of them like the formal top-down learning things are good ways to get a lot of information across. But if you are a competent worker, so if you have all that training and you are working for a couple of years, you can probably do that. There are still 3 moments of learning need that can appear. It's when something changes, when you have to apply something, and when you need to solve a problem. And for these things, you don't want to have a course. So if you encounter a problem, you just want to Google it, find the solution, apply it. So you don't want to go to a classroom or an e-learning course for that. So you just want to have it at your fingertips. But the thing is that a lot of the information that will help you along while you're working is not available on Google because it's not generic information. It's company-specific information. And you need to capture that, and it should be captured in the form of a course. It is what we call at Easygenerator, and we have that in the tool as well, a resource or micro-learning. So you're talking about a how-to guide. You're talking about a checklist. You're talking about sharing best practices. Small learning nuggets like 1-page documents that just says, here's your problem, this is my solution for that problem. And that is a really different approach. So then the context really shapes the form the content will take.
And I think something, Casper, I wanted to pick your brains about, because we touched on it briefly when we spoke before, was this idea of repetition. And I think the context and micro-learning parts actually help create that organic repetition. So the next time a problem arises, I remember that resource helped me solve the problem. I go back and find it again, I apply it again. And not only does that increase the retention, it kind of reduces my reliance on the overall job aid in the first place, because
correct.
Whole thing. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, because that's really a great point. Something we forget is how your brain is wired. So if I simplify, you have like a short-term memory and a long-term memory. And everything every impression you get is stored in your short-term memory, also everything you hear. But that gets like an information overload. So your brain needs to select, and the default way of dealing with that is throwing things away, unless there's a trigger. Okay, I need to store this in the long-term memory. And there are a lot of triggers, like if it's something very emotional. So for example, I remember when the plane hit the Twin Tower because I actually saw that live on TV. At that moment, that it makes so much impact, so you don't forget. But with corporate learning, it's a bit less exciting sometimes and a bit less emotional. And then repetition is the best way to actually beat that forgetting curve. So it's an old concept from Ebbinghaus. It's a psychologist from 1885, I think, is his research. And he found that if you learn a lot of new information, you will forget up to 90% within hours because of the way your brain is wired. And the way to beat that is repetition. And you can already build repetition in your course. So if you have a chapter, summarize your chapter at the end of the chapter. So that's the first repetition. If you have a course, summarize all the chapters and the whole course at the end of the course. But also spread it out over time. So if you want to sort of enforce the retention, it's great to sort of make it top of mind again. So if you, after a week, send out a small video with a recap, people need to think about it again. Or if you send out a small survey that they really have to process the information again with just 3 questions, it will be top of mind again. And those things can trigger long-time retention. So learning is not a one-time thing. Learning is things that spread out over time. But you can also, for example, Nelson touched on maybe a course of hours or minutes. So our take is a course shouldn't be longer than 15 minutes, an online course. So if you have an hour of learning, spread it out over time. And in the first course, do what I just said, but then the second course, start with a recap of the first one. And you do that a week later. So you already have that retention built in. And then in the third course, you do a recap of the first 2. And that way you can do sort of the same. So you can achieve that you have like smaller learning units, which is more effective, but also to spread it out more in time and increase that retention.
Perfect. Yeah, thanks, Kasper. That leads us nicely to rule number 3, which is we need to make it discoverable for the people who need to discover it. So there's another sort of bugbear in marketing here for me, is that people spend so much time creating content, and then the things that will make it discoverable are an afterthought. And a great example is when people write a long blog post and they just spend a couple of minutes creating the title or the headline. The irony being that the headline is the most important thing because it's the thing that will get people connected to the content, but also encourage them to click. And I think that's something that can be applied to L&D as well. So before we sort of touch on some more marketing techniques that L&D can leverage, there's a good framework called the 4 U's, which people can use for sort of headlines, but also for structuring content. These are useful, unique, urgency, and then they copped out a little bit on the last one is ultra specific. But yeah, this can sort of apply to learning content. So useful might be you're thinking about which audience is this useful to, or which context is it most useful in. Unique is what makes this piece of content different. So when people are scrolling through your resources, how does the headline differentiate it from all the other pieces in your library? Ultra specific is probably the best one. This is the details where you can make a promise to people about what that piece of content is going to do for them. And what problem it's going to solve for them. That's the best way to get people to click. And an urgency in an L&D sense is a little bit less applicable, but maybe we can make it in terms of time sensitive. So are you making that clear in the headline of the content? Is it date specific? Is this the pricing for 2022? Is this the pre-event or the post-event resources that you're going to need? But yeah, that's just one of the techniques. And Nelson, I know you've got a few sort of SEO and marketing techniques people can leverage to make it discoverable. So tell us about some of those.
Yeah, I guess the problem here is we're living in a post-content world where content is both cheap and abundant. And so in a world like that, discovery becomes your biggest problem, not creating content. And so how do you help people discover the most relevant content? I think this is where we can, you mentioned a few marketing techniques there, Gary, but, SEO or search engine optimization, for those who are not familiar, there's a lot we can learn from there. For example, with headings and subheadings, what are the keywords? What language do you use in those? Often, as the content creator, we might assume these are the keywords that the learner would use, but actually investing in doing keyword research, you might find the actual employees are using a completely different word to search for this than what you are. And so often we find this in marketing where, we would use Google keyword research tool, which you can also use for internal L&D purposes, is you put in the topic or the word that your content is about, and then Google will use its enormous data set to tell you what are the actual keywords that people are using when they're searching about this particular topic and keyword. And that's a really useful way of making sure you're using the language that your learners would use to discover and search for this content. And so it's by optimizing it for search, it makes it easier to discover. Another thing we do with How Now is we have a browser extension that allows people to search and surface relevant learning in the apps where they work. But we use SEO for that because, say, for example, I'm a salesperson inside Salesforce. how that would automatically suggest relevant learning to you. And if you had Salesforce in the heading and the subheading, you can help the algorithm optimize that suggestion. So it's another way of optimizing for discoverability. And that's where we can learn from marketing.
Kasper, are you seeing that when you're working with people that discoverability is a bit of a problem, and what are your thoughts on how people can overcome?
Yes, it is, because if you look at from an L&D perspective, it's quite a complicated matter, because one of the things is, of course, the SEO approach that Nelson just explained. Another thing that people do a lot is tagging things, so you can search for keywords or tagging in this process, but that is a really hard thing to do proper tagging. You need taxonomies, you need and it's something that will not happen, especially it will not happen in a proper way if subject matter experts are the person who do that. So what I believe, and it's something that it works the same as with Google. So Google is of course the ultimate SEO, the search engine. So if you would look there, you search there, you know that you create sort of like a bubble. It's the same with social media. If you use TikTok or YouTube, they will present content based on what you saw before. And what happens is that you end up in a small bubble, looking within the same context you're always looking in, and you are not able to look outside of the bubble. And I believe, again, it's a person who can break that. So I'm going back to the experts again in the business. So I think that an alternative for searching to keywords, an alternative searching to SEO, is to have somebody who is an aggregator, somebody who is not creating content, but is curating content. So for example, you could ask me, Kasper, create a course on e-learning, and I could create probably a really big course on e-learning with all the ins and outs and stuff like that. What I also could do is just list you these 10 blogs or these 10 books. If you read that, this is the main message. This is what you can take out of it, and that is what you can learn. So I can curate the content. So then it's a person that you trust, an expert, that sort of makes a selection for you and points you in the right direction and adds value in a different way than a search engine or a keyword can do, because they provide a different kind of context, a different kind of meaning there.
Nelson, I think that comes a little bit back to that idea of a sort of change in role for L&D, about being a facilitator and like leveraging the existing communities. Like you said, we need to make it discoverable, but also maybe shareable so that people can easily connect. Recommendations are still the best form of anything, right? Word of mouth. Where did you buy this? What show should I watch? So
if I buy something online, the first thing I do is look at for the reviews, and because that is what helps me a lot, more than the marketing material around it.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, just to kind of add to that, I mean, there's an incredible stat from Google's research team called Think with Google, where they say 80% of the searches include best, top, as a part of the search term, right? So it's everyone's way of trying to filter out and trying to find the best or most relevant or top, and therefore optimizing your kind of content for that really helps.
I think that's another example of that, making headlines unique, because if everyone's just says the best, then you can differentiate by adding content. This is the best for who, this is the best for solving this problem. So I guess you want to avoid that landfill, or you want to stand out among the landfill, I guess, if that does happen. Just to remind people, if you have any questions as we continue to the last couple of rules, then just drop them in the chat. But we kind of touched on it a little bit there. This idea of curating where you can, and then creating where you need to. The idea being that if you curate what's relevant, as Kasper alluded to earlier, you can then create the things that are business specific. So Kasper, maybe tell us a little bit about that concept.
Yes, I already touched on curation, of course, with the experts sort of selecting the content for you. But I think in general, before you start creating the content, you need to think about two things. So one is learning the proper solution? Is this a learning issue that I'm solving? Sometimes it's just a complexity in the business. If you solve that on the business side and make it simpler, then you don't need a course on it. So that is first. So do I need learning? Is learning the proper way to solve the problem? And if it is, then for me, always the question is, what kind of learning do you need? Is it indeed like a formal training? Is it a course? Or is it much more something that people learn while they're working? And it's like a small one-page thing that you just want to have. So that is the one question. And the second question is it already out there? There's so much information. And for example, with Easygenerator, we are a company that's growing quite fast, and we use a methodology for that, scaling up. So, and I'm responsible for that within the company to sort of make sure that everybody understands what it is and how it works, and sort of part of that. And so what I can do, of course, is create a course on scaling up or a webinar on scaling up, explain that. But the thing is, there's just a book, and the book is great. So I just tell people, read the book, but I have a small course where we don't do everything according to the book. So sometimes we do differently. Some things are more important with us. We change something in the rhythm here, we change that. So I only have to add like sort of the 20% on top of the book that I need to do. So, and I think that's the key of curation. So indeed, if it's already out there, use it and don't recreate it, and but curate it. And only if you have something specific to say, something unique to say, something that adds, then you need to start writing. So we need to be way more critical, because we create so much content and there's so much redundancy there.
Yeah, and Nelson, I know you have sort of an interesting framework for how people can curate in sort of 3 steps. Maybe you can explain what that is.
Yeah, so I mean, building on what kind of Kasper said, and it kind of formalizes a lot of what he said. And I look at curation almost like, you know, if any of you have made a mixtape before, do let us know in the chat. But I often like to use the analogy of a mixtape for how you can do curation effectively. But the 3 steps are essentially, the first one being aggregate, which is essentially bringing together. If you take the mixtape analogy, this is when you're essentially bringing together all of the songs that you know, you and your other half really like. And so from an L&E context, it would be, you know, all the blogs, the videos, the podcasts, the courses, and really aggregating all of those resources together. The second step is filter. Now, this is where, once you've got all of your songs, where you filter out the songs that have a special meaning to you and your high school sweetheart. So it might be the song that was playing when you were at prom. It might be the song that was playing on your first date. And so you filter out those songs that have a special meaning. So within an L&D context, this is where you're filtering out what is relevant. Now, that's not just an L&D job. That could be L&D setting the guidelines for other people to filter out what they think is useful and relevant for those moments that matter, or for your sector, or for the business that you're running. And the third step is enrich. So enrich is when you're putting together that mixtape. It's when you're recording those little intros and outros, and you're adding your own little personalized bit to tell your high school sweetheart why this song means so much to you. And so from an L&D context, this is when you're highlighting certain things, or you're contextualizing a particular blog for your business, right? It might be a generic blog around how to run a business in the economic downturn. You might then enrich that by contextualizing it for how do you run a tech business, or how do you run an e-commerce business for in an economic downturn. So that's when you add your bit, and the creation part comes in. So aggregate, filter, and enrich. But definitely agree with Kasper. I mean, curation is the new creation. And if we're going to be able to meet people's moments of need at the rate they need to be met, then curation is the tool that's going to help us do that.
Maybe to add on that, because I really like your 3 steps, but originally curation, of course, comes from musea, where a curator is the person who create the show. And what they do, because if you go into a museum, you don't have like, okay, here are all the pictures of Rembrandt. That doesn't work. So you need to tell a story there. And that's also what happens with creation. You need to have a story, you have a line. For example, you could look at Rembrandt and say, he's really great with light. So you could create an exposition based on that and have people tell the story and use the painting as an example. So then you get a really different kind of form. And indeed, what is really key, so it's not just like with the paintings, you hang 10 paintings on the wall. No, it is that you as a curator add your bits to it. You explain to the audience why you selected this piece and why it's here and why it's in this order, because then you add value. Otherwise, it's just like a top 10 list, and then it's just, okay, I have to see what it is, but you don't give the guidance. So that is really, really important indeed.
Right. Yeah, I think the simplest and most common example I've seen with across organizations that we work with is playlists. Is they've empowered internal experts and senior leaders within the business to create simple playlists. I mean, we saw some really good ones where we saw people from the C-suite sharing playlists of, you know, this is what helps me with leadership, build leadership skills. And it's a mix of podcasts, books, and so simple. to get that together, but so valuable, because if someone I look up to in the business and is doing the job I want to do, is sharing a set of learning resources that help them build that particular skill, and that makes it super relevant for me as an individual who aspires to that. And I think that's a simple way of putting curation into practice.
Yeah, totally agree. And Kasper, I've learned from you now that art isn't subjective. People need to know why they like it, right? We only have one rule left, and then we could take a couple of questions maybe. But the last one is probably my favorite, and it's that timing beats perfection. So that it comes back to these moments that matter, but the best timed content will always beat the best produced content. I actually saw a really good LinkedIn post from someone called George Terry about this the other day, and he was talking about someone who built a newsletter with 8,000 people and turned it into a consultancy business just by using a Google Doc that he updates every month with new findings. And then in the post that he shared with it, he said that marketers obsess over look and feel, and our audiences don't. And that really does speak to the whole content creation. People don't want the most polished PDF. They want the thing that's going to help them do what they need to do now. So yeah, just to bring in both of you for the thoughts on sort of frictionless content creation and, you know, creating it in the format that matters, not the format that's, you know, sort of vanity project. And Nelson, maybe we'll start with you, and we'll bring it Kasper.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think this kind of goes back to a philosophical or mindset shift of outcome over output, and often, you know, traditional L&D has come from very much a kind of production mindset of producing a lot of content and courses, and therefore it's all about, you know, the production values. Is it on brand? Has it got the right look and feel? And they're being, well, they thought they were being measured on the quality of that output from its look and feel versus the outcome that it actually drives. You know, does it help solve a business challenge? Does it help actually improve the performance? And when you shift your mindset to focus on outcome over output, I think very quickly you realize a lot of the things that you're probably investing time and money in don't matter to the learner. And I think a great day-to-day example, we've probably all been there, but I remember when my boiler went bust and it was showing an error message. You know, I Googled, what the hell does this error message mean? And I found this YouTube video of a guy who's literally the worst camera angle on his phone. You could just about see the error message, and his voice is explaining exactly what you need to do. It was about 30 seconds long. I followed his steps, and it had millions of views. This terrible video had millions of views with people who followed his instructions. And in the comments, they were like, "You're a savior, mate. That was incredible." And what that essentially tells you is when you're in those moments that matter and you have a challenge or performance problem, getting the right content makes all the difference. So the relevance is more important than the kind of production values and all of that. So definitely being immediately relevant, that speed over perfection is what matters when you're trying to serve people's needs.
Yeah, Kasper, do you have any?
Yeah, I like the direction, because indeed you sort of switched it around from timing beats perfection to relevance beats perfection. I think that is really true, because, for example, if I remember like 15 years ago, when you want to do really high level e-learning, you would use video and you had a camera crew and actors and a script and lighting, and you would pay $100,000 to make that happen. Right now, it's the most normal case that I just grab my phone, shoot a practical situation in real life, and use that in an e-learning course. And it's complete what Nelson says. So the quality is completely different, but the relevance may be even greater than the whole produced video, because it's just something that shows how it is, like your error message. It is just what you need, and then the key thing is how to find that just in time. So context, where we talked about earlier about, is crucial here, but it is not about the quality. And well, quality has two things. Quality is about the content quality. So how relevant is it for you? How does it solve my problem? But it's not how shiny it is. And indeed, what Nelson said before, a lot of instruction design, I think, when content is being used enough, we need to make it more interactive, more shiny, and polish it here, polish it there. Sometimes the solution is bringing it down to the core and making it really, really simple. And this is just the learning nuggets you need. Okay, I have an appetite for this, and this is exactly what I get. And so I think that, yeah, less is more.
And there are great, accessible, free tools to get people started on this, right? And we often, sometimes people use tools and tech as an excuse if they can't get the budget to get a particular tool. Obviously, it makes your life easier when you've got the right tech in place. But there are also, free tools like Loom is a great way to get started, just to create quick video content using a browser extension. There's Canva, which I'm sure most people listening to this are using. Just creating content right now shouldn't of a decent, acceptable quality doesn't, like Kasper mentioned, doesn't no longer require a studio and a huge production team. And anything where you're investing that kind of time and effort, the question you've got to ask yourself is it really worth it if you send across the best looking course 6 months after the moment of need has passed? Does it really matter? And that's really the question to ask yourself.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, and on top of that, so the biggest learning platforms in the world are YouTube and TikTok. So, and if you look at the quality of the videos, that is not very much produced very often. So, and there's so much. I built a greenhouse in my garden. I never did that before. I built it from wood and glass, first time ever, and learned everything I need to learn from YouTube. So that's how it worked for me. Yeah.
Yeah, we now need to see a picture of this, Kasper. I think when the show notes go out, we need a link to a picture of this greenhouse.
I have. I'm really proud of it. It was really, it actually worked out a lot.
It's testament to the University of YouTube. Nelson's boiler's fixed. Kasper's got a greenhouse. I guess it speaks to one of the rules, like earlier, managing communities or facilitating. Like these are the things people are already doing. The Loom example is a good one. People are already sending each other Loom videos, voice notes as well. Like they take the so low friction. You can explain someone step by step just using a voice note, and it costs you, it's built into all the tools you're already using. So I think that would be a good example for people. We do have a couple of questions. One of them, well, first we'll bring in Chi-Chi and then Andy, but Chi-Chi, your question is coming back to the previous one around curation, just to give Nelson and Kasper some context, but yeah, fire away.
Yeah, thank you both. This has been such a helpful session to come to. Thank you so much. So yeah, I wanted to ask this question really around, particularly when you're looking at curating content. I love this approach and I do it a lot, but it's also that balance between the perception that we're not creating anything. You're not, so where's the value if you're not creating something new from scratch? So I'm keen to hear sort of how you reposition that, because I do think it's valuable. There's so much out there that you sometimes don't need to create things from brand new. How do you then position that to say like this is equally as valuable because you're getting enrichment from like lots of different sources versus like let's just create something new from one source, if that makes sense.
Yeah, maybe. I think just to go on, Kasper. You go. You go.
Okay. Yeah, well, I think that we already touched a bit on that because it is not what you create that matters. It's the impact that it has on people, the result that it delivers. So if you can solve an issue with a curation or a learning need with curation, that is what it's all about. So it's not to focus on the content that you create and your output. It's what you actually deliver as value to the business, what matters.
Yeah, and I think repeating a stat I mentioned earlier about the think with Google saying 80% of people are looking for the best. What that tells you is we're looking for some way of validating that this is the best thing for me, and the kind of curation piece does that. So just take a simple example of, let's say I want to become a better leader and I'm looking for a book on leadership. There are thousands of books on leadership, but for you to do the work of having gone through all of these books, see what aligns with the company's worldview, what has been recommended by other people, and to curate and tell me, actually, here's the leadership book that's going to be best for you, given where you are in your career, given the company that we're in. This is going to be that effort, right? Like how many times have we all sat in front of Netflix, then Googled, what's the best show on Netflix to watch right now? That is curation, right? That is someone else doing the curation to save your time and energy that you would otherwise spend searching. And the reality is, most employees, we're time poor, right? We're busy, and so we don't have the time to do that searching and figuring out, is this good for me or not? And that value is, I think, what the business case is. For curation is to say, look, all of this time you would be wasting in searching and finding and validating whether this is the right resource. Well, we're doing that for you, or putting a curation guideline in place to let the community do that for you, so we can find what's going to be the best or the most relevant learning content for us.
Amazing. Thank you both.
Cool. Thanks, Chi-Chi. And Andy, you had a question earlier, but I think it was kind of before we got to the whole points around organizing content. So maybe, did you want to come on and ask that question? And now you have a bit more context. I think I can see Andy's still here, but maybe he's not seen. But yeah, I'll just sort of pitch it to you. I think it comes back to organizing content, and Andy's question was around like knowledge base versus LMS, what the differences are, how they can be used for organizing content, I think is the context of that. So Nelson, did you want to come in first, and then we'll loop in Kasper?
Yeah, I think this is a really good one, because I think the definition of learning content is massively changing, right? Like the idea of before, knowledge and knowledge management was a very separate department to learning would typically refer to courses or training programs, and that's what the remit was. But the reality is that the employee doesn't care about any of this, right? The employee doesn't care about knowledge base, LMS. That's a very admin L&D problem. What they care about is, I want the thing that's going to help solve my problem right now. Now that could be knowledge, that could be a course, that could be a program, that could be a live synchronous session. And so they don't really care. And that's why, we're big believers in moving towards a learning ecosystem approach, where that ecosystem can contain, content libraries, it can contain knowledge bases, it can contain internal systems like your SharePoints and Google Drives. It can also contain blogs, podcasts, webinars, etc. The reality is, not all of the learning we want to do lives inside a knowledge base or an LMS, right? If I asked all of you on this call, when was the last time you learned something that had a big impact on your performance and career, it's very, very unlikely that most of you would say the LMS, right? Yet most of a learning tech budget goes on an LMS, but most of our time is spent elsewhere learning. And so that's why we need to move away from this single system that's going to have all my e-learning in one place, and move towards a platform that allows you to bring your ecosystem together and makes it easily accessible. And so I think the difference there is purely semantics and how the market has categorized products, but the employee doesn't care.
I agree, and I think it touches on a big trend, and that I would name the trend from bottom up to top down. So an LMS is really a bottom up tool. So it's for the LMS department to push content to the learner. It's like, if you compare it, it's like a TV. It has a fixed program, and you as a viewer can only follow the program of the broadcaster. And what is happening is that things are moving bottom up, and knowledge management system, but also LXPs like how now are really facilitating you like Netflix is. So it has sort of the same content, but it allows you to search whenever you need it for what you want. So you are in charge. So instead of the learning department telling you what to do, it's you as a learning taking charge of your own development, which makes sense because people are not working for a company for like 40 years anymore. So they are moving on. So they are in charge of their own development. And I think that's the key thing. So I think from my perspective, an LMS is a top-down thing. So if you have like mandatory training, like compliance and security training, that is the right way. But for all the business learning that you want to do, the things that you need to know, a bottom-up approach through an LXP or a performance system or a knowledge base is much more effective.
Cool. Kasper, I'm going to butcher something that you said to me before, because Andy added some more context in the chat around just getting people to post knowledge. But you mentioned something to me around when you ask people to capture that knowledge, the temptation is there to just empty their brain of kind of everything that's in there related to that topic. And that maybe back to the using internal experts, you do need to make them sort of problem focused, don't they? So they can capture the right knowledge to overcome a problem. So yeah, maybe we can spend a couple of minutes just hearing your thoughts on that.
Yeah, correct. So it has to do again with what you want to achieve with your course. So it's not about the course you create, about how shiny your content is, what it actually does in the business. And I am really a believer of Cathy Moore. Cathy Moore has a theory that she calls action mapping. So she started out with learning objectives and stuff like that. And she found that there is no value in business learning if one, the learning goal is not connected to your business goal, and two, if it's not actionable, if it doesn't change behavior. Because if you just know stuff in a company, there's no real value there. You need to be able to apply it. You need to be able to do something. So that is something that I'm currently designing what we call our Easy Assistant. So it's sort of a step-by-step thing, a sort of wizard-like thing that will help them experts not to dump all the knowledge they have, but to really think, okay, what are people able to do after they took this bit of learning? And then from that perspective, how am I going to make that possible? What do I need to tell them? And not only that, what do I need to tell them to make them have either change behavior or create new behavior? Because that's what it's all about. And then if you do that, so we did some experiments then. And the really funny thing is, if you ask these people to write something about a topic, or you do this approach, courses tend to be like 70 to 80% smaller, just because people have more focus on what is it what you need in the end, what does the learner really need, and not what is the knowledge that you have, and just dump it out. So that's sort of my 5 cents on that.
Cool. Nelson, we're at kind of the last couple of minutes now, but do you have any sort of final some thoughts on what Kasper just said there?
No, I think I was just picking up the kind of question Chi-Chi's written around the kind of measuring great content, building on kind of talking about content creation, etc. I mean, this is a beast of a topic in itself, Chi-Chi, but to kind of give you my 2 cents worth on this, we typically talk about 3 types of proof when we're helping companies measure impact. And the first one is proof of knowledge. And this is probably what most of us on this call are already doing. So this is when you have your tests, your quizzes, your assessments. It's basically checking whether, if I watched a video of someone riding a bike, am I able to repeat those steps back to you? It doesn't mean I can ride the bike, but I can tell you how someone rides a bike. The second one is proof of skill. So this is where, can I now get on a bike and actually ride it for you? And so different ways of applying the knowledge I've gained. So it could be a simulation, it could be a stretch assignment, it could be putting me on a project and seeing how I work. And a great way of measuring this is 360 feedback. Is, you know, the best people to evidence whether I'm applying knowledge in the relevant context is the people who work with me and my manager. So 360 feedback is often a great way of capturing that skills feedback. And the third one is proof of performance. So this goes back to what Kasper was just talking around, your kind of outcome, and what is that outcome you're trying to drive. So it might be reducing the sales cycle, or increasing your conversion rate, or reducing the number of errors. And this is where you essentially use quantitative and qualitative data to build your story for proof of performance. So the quantitative data is the KPI I just told you. So it might be, have we increased our sales conversion rate? The qualitative is speaking to your sales reps and your sales leader and asking them, do you think the learning you did influenced how you perform? And that's enough for you to build your narrative, right? If they said it has some influence, that's enough to build your impact narrative. And that's proof of performance. So we typically say these 3 things are a combination of leading indicators, but a way of building a narrative where you can start to demonstrate impact. That was a super fast summary of it, but hopefully that's helpful.
Really helpful. Thank you. Thanks, Nelson.
Brilliant. That brings us nicely to time. So thank you everyone for joining us today. Kasper, thanks a lot for sharing your insights with us. When the show notes go out and the link, the email goes to everyone, your LinkedIn profile will be there, so will the Easygenerator one, so people can connect with you. But thanks everyone who joined, and thank you, Kasper.
Well, thank you. I enjoy doing it.
Cool.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you, everyone.
See you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.